Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Moya Bailey for her book, Misogynoir Transformed, in conversation with Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. My name is Bree, and I'm the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you all join our community this evening. We appreciate your support of Moya and an independent bookstore through your purchase and attendance. Like I said, the chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. They're right down at the bottom of your Zoom. If you're going to use chat, please set it to all panelists and attendees so you can talk to other people in the audience. And please make sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so that they don't get lost in the chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein is an assistant professor of physics and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred is her first book. Moya Bailey is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. She currently curates the #TransformedDH Tumblr initiative in digital humanities and is also the digital alchemist of the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network. She's an MLK visiting scholar at MIT for the 2020-2021 academic year. When Moya first coined the term misogynoir, she defined it as the ways anti-Black and misogynistic representation shaped broader ideas about Black women, particularly in visual, culture, and digital spaces. She had no idea that the term would go viral, touching a cultural nerve and quickly entering into the lexicon. At a time when Black women are depicted as more ugly, deficient, hypersexual, and unhealthy than their non-Black counterparts, Misogynoir Transformed highlights Black women's remarkable efforts to disrupt mainstream narratives, subvert negative stereotypes, and reclaim their lives. Focusing on queer and trans Black women, she shows us the importance of carving out digital spaces. It's a pleasure to have them both with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein and Moya Bailey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just want to begin by saying I'm so excited to be here with my friend Chanda. It's been a real pleasure just to talk to you about the book and your book. And I know you've been reluctant for us to talk about your book tonight. I mean, I do know that it is, an opportunity to talk about mine, but there's so much between our books that I think is important to discuss. But I'm gonna start with a reading. But before I do that, I wanted to thank everyone for attending and for being here, and to acknowledge that I am joining you from land that is traditionally stewarded by the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag, and that seems important to mention even in this moment where we have been moved to do things digitally, that it is all happening across land that is still not stewarded by those original stewards of the land. So I'm going to begin by reading a bit from the preface of the book. And I really like the preface because it's the origin story of both, I guess, my really deep dive into Black feminism and how I came to see it. And I hope you enjoy it as well. Okay. Although I did not know it at the time, I started writing this book as an undergraduate at Spelman College. I was on the road to becoming a medical doctor when two things happened that made me shift course. I fell in love with women's studies, and I got international attention as one of the leaders of a small pushback on campus against the rapper Nelly. Both events profoundly shaped my thinking about the way Black women are treated in society and moved me to coin the term misogynoir, which in turn led to this book. As a first-year student from tiny Fayetteville, Arkansas, I was appalled when Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall told the Spelman College entering class of 2005 about Sarah Bartman's experiences as a human exhibit in Europe during the early 19th century. Bartman, a young Khoisan woman from what we now recognize as South Africa, was displayed throughout Europe to paying white audiences as an example of the animalistic and inferior nature of the African woman. Implicit in Bartman's display was a comparison between her body and that of the white women who viewed her. European scientists equated anatomical differences with sexual deviance, drawing conclusions about her sexuality and subsequently the sexuality of Black women from her form. Her butt and genitalia were used to justify racist and sexualized violence, as well as the continued enslavement of Africans in the quote-unquote New World. Dr. Guy-Sheftall explained that the exploitative way Bartman's body was treated in life and in death was made possible under the guise of quote-unquote objective science, though what Bartman actually endured was objectification through scientific racism and sexism. In my first week at Spelman, before I had even attended a class, Dr. Guy-Sheftall had challenged my thinking by describing the differential treatment Black women experienced on a global stage. After that moment, I knew I wanted to take every class I could with her. I was awakened to the profundity of the unique nexus of experience that is Black and woman on this planet and throughout colonial history. Along with enrolling in Dr. Guy-Sheftall's classes, I took classes with fellow feminist professor, Dr. M. Bahati Kaumba, who we affectionately called Dr. K, who gave me the final nudge into the open arms of the comparative women's studies major at Spelman. As I was matriculating, I got involved in the feminist political organizations on campus, all of which were supported by the Women's Research and Resource Center, the home of the Comparative Women's Studies Department. It was Dr. K who asked, "You're taking all the classes, why not be a major?" And when she put it that way, there was no room for rebuttal. But in truth, I was a willing convert, despite still having every intention of attending medical school, but that was not to be. As a 19-year-old junior and then president of the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, I showed the group Nelly's music video for the song Tip Drill, which had started airing on the late night television show BET Uncut. The video featured most memorably a scene where Nelly slides a credit card down the crack of a Black woman's butt. Our group decided to name him our misogynist of the month, not knowing that the Spelman Student Government Association had agreed to partner with Nelly and his foundation to hold a bone marrow registration drive on our campus in an effort to save the life of his sister who had leukemia. FMLA raised questions about the misogynoir in his video and lyrics, and when we heard that Nelly was invited to campus, it seemed only fair that we ask him about the way he represented Black women, since he was asking us for our help. Nelly declined our offer to talk about his music, and instead he went to the press, twisting the story such that it seemed that Spelman canceled the bone marrow registration drive because of the video, an assertion that many still believe today, though we orchestrated our own drive. The story garnered national and eventually international headlines, both praising and condemning Spelman students for daring to talk back to the music. It was a hard lesson in the hypervisibility and invisibility of being a Black woman. And I'll insert here that this was my first experience with death threats. And if you could imagine, I don't know, this is before social media. So like people, I was joking with a friend, I was like, people actually had to put in work to like find our campus addresses and send us hate mail. It was a different time. But Nelly felt entitled to our assistance with saving his sister's life, but did not feel that he had to address us, the Black women who dealt with the fallout of his video and lyrics in our day-to-day lives. As young Black women, we felt the impact of the video and lyrics in the form of street harassment in the United States and abroad. We dealt with assumptions about our sexual availability to men in the form of unsolicited commentary on our bodies, on our clothing, and on our time. He used his celebrity built on the bodies of Black women to urge people to support an underappreciated cause, the health of Black women. Black women are far less likely to find a matching bone marrow donor than their white counterparts, in part because of Black people's deep distrust of the systemic racism in medicine, which makes them less likely to volunteer to donate. What was not quite clear to me in 2004 was the irony of using a fame garnered through limiting representations of Black women while refusing to address that decision and also wanting support from those very same Black women. I wasn't quite able to connect the dots between popular media representations of Black women and my and other Black women's experiences with discriminatory housing practices, intimate partner violence, street harassment, employment discrimination, and ill treatment from healthcare providers. But my interest in the role media played in shaping the perceptions of Black women became all-consuming, such that the goal of becoming a medical doctor morphed into getting a doctorate to investigate the role that media representations play in the treatment of Black women patients by white doctors. I learned about the ways historical popular culture seeped into the consciousness of supposedly objective future physicians, which prompted me to consider how popular culture representations influence Black women's treatment in society and medicine today. It was in writing that dissertation that I landed on the word misogynoir to describe the particular venom directed at Black women through negative representations in media. And I'm actually going to stop there so that we have a good amount of time to talk, Chanda. So just a little taste, and I hope also giving some hints to why I was so excited to speak with Chanda tonight, given kind of my own science background that I think pops up a little bit in the pages of the book.
Yeah, so let me start by saying that this was a hard event to prepare for because Moya is a good friend of mine, and I felt particularly, we can have a long conversation about this later, but I wanted to get it perfect. So let me start by saying—
I have thoughts about that.
Yes, of course you do. So let me start by saying I'm not a media studies person. I am someone who does Black feminist theory, but this book is so incredibly readable, no matter kind of what positionality that you're coming from. And so I just want to remark on that and say, for anybody who's like, I'm not sure that the book, I will be able to follow it, it is as clear as that preface was. So if you were able to understand the preface, you will be able to follow the rest of the book. So I want to encourage people to pick it up. So you, on page 11, you say Black women's digital resistance is a form of self-preservation and harm reduction that disrupts the onslaught of the problematic images that society perpetuates. And so in some sense, the way that I experienced the book was, to me, this is the heart. And you kind of like rotate around this idea and look at it through different lenses. And I would actually say it's not just images, right? But behaviors, sort of broadly, like an image as behavior, maybe. And at the same time, particularly at the beginning of the book, you're very careful to articulate that not everyone engaging in these activities should receive the label of Black feminist. That we need to be careful about mixing Black women's digital resistance and Black feminist in some sense. And you're also kind of talking about a journey that you yourself went on in some sense, right? of engaging in digital resistance and maybe that translating into Black feminist thought becoming your main intellectual line in some way, and Black queer feminist thought, I should say. So I was wondering if you could say more about what you mean about that distinction, and what are the tensions that are kind of at work there?
Oh, thank you for that question, Chanda. So one thing that is important is that I didn't start identifying as a Black feminist until I left Spelman. Mm-hmm. So at Spelman, feminism was Black. It was just understood that we were centered. So I never felt like I needed to modify feminism until I left, and that wasn't other people's assumption. So using the term and phrase Black feminism was a way to signal my connection, and then also this genealogy that was very much a part of what I called feminism from my first interactions with the term. And when I started to think about Black feminism and how I wanted people to take it up, thinking about it in relationship to how it gets used in connection or as a stand-in for Black women. I was also thinking about how so many of the Black feminists who shaped me were women. So one of my really good friends is Yolo Akili, a Black non-binary person who was one of my early mentors in terms of feminism. And it felt strange to think about feminism only through this idea that Black feminists were always women. And I also, again, went to Spelman, and I met a lot of Black women who were not feminists. And part of the Spelman experience too, in relationship to the Nellie event that I described in the preface, was feeling alienated from classmates who felt like we robbed them of the opportunity to meet Nellie, and who were upset and didn't like the fact that there was a feminist group on campus. So for me, it was very clear from the beginning that those two things were not synonymous. And, but this is also part of my feminist training, in that one of the beautiful things about Black feminist scholarship is getting access to frameworks like standpoint theory, and learning that, it's not that Black women automatically have a radical political ideology, but they have that potential because of how they're situated in society. So that situatedness is important. It creates a possibility, but it isn't guaranteed. And so the examples that I provide show perhaps some possibilities and also not, and people who don't inhabit a term and their work is messy. So there are ways that, depending on how you look at it, you could argue one is, one isn't, and that ambiguity was important for me to signal.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about the book is that I think one of the things that happens in the academy now, and more broadly with writing by Black women, is that it gets articulated as this is a Black feminist book because a Black woman wrote it. And I think that in some ways, by talking very openly about where Black feminism is located in your thought, you clarify this is a Black feminist book because I said it's a Black queer feminist book, not because you're going to look at the title and see Black women or see a Black woman's photo on the cover. And so I will say, you talk in the introduction about not trying to introduce too many terms. And you say, I've already introduced misogynoir, but I feel like, at least for me, and I'm sure lots of people in the audience, they've seen misogynoir out in the wild, out in use. And so in some sense, that's not what's new about the book. So what I heard actually as new was the phrase transforming misogynoir, and also the phrase digital alchemy. So I want to come to digital alchemy first. It felt like such a brilliant and valuable move, because then every time you used it in the book, I understood exactly what you meant. That it is this digital resistance, it's a digital tinkering. This is how I kind of framed it in my mind. What was partly interesting is that you are very careful not to give like a very hard and fast definition of it in some ways, but kind of allow it to grow throughout the text. And so you and I have had some interesting conversations about differences in how we see things sometimes. Specifically about, like, as a scientist, sometimes I'm like, you're messing with pseudoscience type stuff. And at the same time, I saw the way you deployed alchemy here, and I was like, if Moya wasn't thinking about those things, would she have come up with this term? So I think the question that I have for you is like, is this term an example of why scientists like me need to be more flexible in how we think about people's interest in things like alchemy or horoscopes or the supernatural?
Yes, yes. And I so appreciate that question, Chanda, because I was thinking about, this is such a beautiful segue into your book, because as I was reading Disordered Cosmos, I was thinking, like, it's the metaphors and analogies of physics that compel you. And I like the metaphors and analogies in astrology to some degree. And I think there's some like real potential there in terms of what you draw on to make what seems abstract and difficult for people to understand, how you make it land with people and connect it to things that they might have more easy access to. And so, yeah, definitely alchemy is something that, interestingly enough, I came to through Patricia Williams, Black legal scholar, and her book, The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And that, to me, really opened my mind to thinking about alchemy. But also, I think it's continuing because in my new position at Northwestern, one of the things that I'm doing is building a digital humanities lab that I'm calling the Digital Humanities Apothecary. So I feel like I have this real, I don't know, these throwbacks to medieval and these magical or things that are not considered to be the province of science TM. And I think my contribution, or something that I'm trying to think about, is how do we bridge science TM with the humanities and these places where science used to also include healing and the healing part of medicine has definitely fallen by the wayside in terms of an attention to the science of medicine. So I definitely see that as being part of what I am thinking through.
So at the risk of suggesting that maybe there's a little bit of reactiveness to white supremacy here, your answer makes me think about the work of Kwasi Wiredu, who is a Ghanaian philosopher, who I think is sometimes controversial in African philosophy, because he is actually, maybe in ways that would feel familiar based on conversations you've had with me, really strong feelings about rationalism and the importance of rational approaches to knowledge formation and knowledge production. But one of the very interesting things that he does in his writing is that he argues that Europeans are susceptible to the same levels of irrationality that people often publicly accuse Africans of being susceptible to. And so part of his argument is that he says he believes that Africans are irrational, But he says you can find just the same amount of that crap, basically. I'm paraphrasing, but along those lines in Europe. So what's the difference?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about your answer and how you are invoking these terms from a period of time that in some sense our post-Enlightenment Euro-American epistemic community likes to disown as like, that was the before times and that is not the now times. And so I'm kind of wondering if that's part of the dynamic around like your engagement with these words, or if that's just like, a side effect or.
Yeah, no, I really love thinking about space-time. And one of my favorite theorists thinking about space-time is Jackie Alexander and her book, Pedagogies of Crossing. And in that book, she gives this concept of palimpsestic time, which is that time is shaped by things that have come before it, and that those things bleed through, that they aren't sedimentary layers. They are constantly, the past is constantly bleeding through and affecting our present. So I definitely feel like there is an element of time as nonlinear and collapsed and intermeshed and interwoven that is affecting my use of these throwback terms. And I also don't think I'm alone in this. I think this is something of the moment, of the zeitgeist of the moment. And a lot of people are having a similar response.
So one of the reasons, I know I just seem like super into digital alchemy, but one of the reasons it jumped out at me is I think it pairs perfectly with this framing of transforming misogynoir and misogynoir transformed. That it really, when you think about what alchemy is kind of in the popular imagination, it is these transformations that maybe seem impossible. And, in this moment where there's lots of discourse about Afro-pessimism versus Afrofuturism, that there is a segment of our community that's saying it's not you can't transform it. It's not transformable. Misogynoir is misogynoir, anti-Blackness is anti-Blackness. And basically you're kind of arguing that actually Black women and gender minorities, Black women and NBs and genderqueer folks are transforming misogynoir every day. And so I think that that's interesting, and they're doing it through this digital alchemy. That's kind of that's how I heard it. So I kind of wonder, like, where do you kind of locate yourself in that conversation about what does it mean? Is it possible? Is it completely transformable? Is there a future where misogynoir, where people study your book as a historical artifact only and not as a discourse of this moment?
Yeah, I do think that misogynoir can be transformed. And part of the interest in transformation is also thinking about transformative justice, like drawing on the work of Mariam Kaba and others who have really tried to uplift and get us to think about what does justice look like that is not what we have now. We're not in a culture in which we can restore. Like there's nothing to restore us to that is useful, in my opinion. So I definitely feel like we need to think about how do we transform misogynoir into something that we need, and thinking about, how a law of science, nothing is destroyed, only transformed. I really want to take all of the negative energy that is directed at Black women and figure out how to redirect it, because misogynoir is actually quite powerful. And this actually has me thinking about N.K. Jemisin too. And, her series dealing with the gods and how there's there's this force that has not been attended to, but becomes so powerful, but it needs to be attended to in the sense that you can't just ignore the negative, you have to address it.
Yeah, that makes me think of the work of Banu Subramaniam.
Hi, Banu.
Oh, Banu's here. Okay. Hi, Banu. Particularly like her recent work on science and Hindu nationalism. And, thinking about science and forces and science as a social force and as a social tool, that part of the task here also is who does the digital serve and how is the digital built? And as a subset of the questions of like, who does science serve? How does science become this like nationalist project? Which we can think of lots of examples of, right? And scientific racism is like a really good example of like a foundational scientific project that is also nationalist in nature. So I guess like part of what interested me about this though is that you're not just documenting this transformation. And I guess I'll just say as a side note that I think that the people who are engaging in misogynoir transformation are maybe taking baby steps towards Black feminism, even if that's not where they are. That's kind of like you start doing this and then you tumble down into the Black feminist rabbit hole. But I think your book in a big way resets the discursive context for Black feminism by like never taking your focus off Black women. Like there's never a moment where I think that your focus is not on Black women and girls. But you also push back against old boundaries that define these identities and even spend time talking about people who are NBs, non-binary people, who also recognize that they're socially recognized as women or girls. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how that worked, like how you held yourself accountable in doing that work.
Yeah, it felt really important because there are people in my life who experience misogynoir even though they don't identify as women. And it felt important to tell that story because it has everything to do with them being misgendered, and also like part of the misogynoir that they experience is that initial misgendering of them, in addition to specific misogynoir that seems to be about policing their gender because they're not doing Black womanhood correctly. So there's a real opportunity, and I think that those of us who are on the margins of womanhood are the ones who feel a real need to push back, because not only have I been misgendered through this process, but also I see how this is affecting lots of different people. So to attend to that, in the examples that I gave, I really wanted readers to challenge even their assumptions about who Black women are. So something I ask people to do in the introduction is to, when they see the words Black woman, or when they see that phrase, to think of trans and queer Black women first, because there's definitely an assumption for a lot of people that when you say Black women, you mean, cis straight women. And that to me was an opportunity to reset who we center when we use that term.
So you talk about this a lot in your first chapter, Misogynoir is a Drag. I want it to be taught. I want everybody to read this. If they read nothing else, I want everybody to read this one chapter. And you have this discussion around page 62, page 63, just for people who want to look these things up later. You say Black girls are disproportionately disciplined for behavior or, quote, attitude infractions when compared to their white girl and Black boy counterparts. And you go on to say that researchers found that Black girls were routinely perceived as older than their white peers. So I was familiar with the latter piece, that Black children in general are often perceived as older, and that this is particularly stark with Black girls. But I hadn't quite put it together with the attitude disciplining that specifically happens to Black girls more than white girls and more than Black boys. And it actually had me wondering, does that ever stop? Or like, you know, when we're 25, are people imagining that we're basically like a 40-year-old? I mean, just, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm putting numbers on it. And what does that mean for our conversations about like Black adulthood and adult Black womanhood, particularly for people who are maybe transitioning into living out loud as Black women?
And this is also the piece that's hard, because of course we have the saying, Black don't crack. There's this expectation that we look younger than we are. So that to me also adds a layer of, I'm being adultified, but also being somewhat infantilized, because there's an assumption that I'm younger than I am. I don't know if you've experienced this, but you know, even as recently as before the pandemic, I've been, you know, treated as if I am a student on my campus as opposed to a faculty member. And I think that's also has everything to do with the idea of where we expect Black women to be, what kind of space we expect Black women to take up. There was a whole conversation too in relationship to Black women in other fields, like, yes, I am a professor, yes, I am a doctor, all of these ways that Black women are denied their actual wisdom, not even just their age, but you know, the intellectual pursuits that have garnered them the positions that they should be recognized for. And I think that's another way that misogynoir gets enacted, not just at the level of physical or you know, numerical age, but also in terms of expertise and understanding who we are in the world.
So I thought about this in two directions. So one was, I guess a little bit was about like, what does this say about my experience? And I specifically went to a moment where I got introduced to some colleagues at the University of New Hampshire. And somebody said, "Oh, are these graduate students in your program?" And someone said, "No, this is our colleague over in the physics department." And there's that moment where you're like, this is both a compliment, but also it's two-sided, right?
Exactly.
So I also thought about this in the other direction. And this is, again, I think speaks to the power of the way that you just reset when we think about who Black feminism serves and who we need to be thinking about who Black feminism needs to serve. That one of the questions that I had is all of this data that we have about children and the experiences of children is very much embedded within the binary. And so you tell a story in the book about a Black trans woman who, as a child, got into trouble for talking to, as we say, like, I don't know, flirting with. I don't know how to translate that into non-AAV, I guess, but who was talking to a boy. And of course, at the time, the way that their community must have experienced it was, this is like, is he a little gay boy, right? That's how they must have been thinking about it. But this is a person who's a girl. This is a person who's going to grow up to be a woman. And I think that raises really deep questions about how we are interpreting these data sets that we get, about when we say, well, this happens to Black boys and this happens to Black girls. I think some people might say, oh yeah, but it's a small percentage. So statistically speaking, those results are basically the same. But is that the right way to think about it? Or do we need to be rethinking how we do those analyses and what information they're giving us about Black childhood?
Absolutely. I think that we need to disaggregate the data, and that is a challenge in so many ways because people are coming into themselves as data is happening, right? So it isn't the case that you'll always know whether you have a non-binary child in your study, but unfortunately, the way we collect data, there isn't even an opportunity to interrogate that because a lot of times it's based on the researcher's own opinions and interpretations. It's really interesting when we think about how we collect data and what our process and praxis is around that, because, you could be looking at what the school provides if you're given data about students in a classroom, or even if you're doing a teaching observation and you're somebody who is doing ethnographic work in a school, you might not be the kind of ethnographer who is thinking about these students who don't fit the binary. And so you might miss some things that might give you clues that there's more to the story there. There's more to this child's narrative. So I definitely think that we have to do more work to create opportunities for those stories to be told. And again, this is so tricky because with IRB, as you know, working with kids is hard. Under 18, there are special restrictions. Also, schools in lots of states and places are actually punishing and criminalizing non-binary trans kids. So there's a real reticence, I think, on children to disclose, even if they had the opportunity to provide that information. But this is also happening at the level of adults. And one of the things that I note in the book, and something that the trans community has been very vocal about, is that there have been trans deaths that don't get recorded as such because people use somebody's dead name and use the incorrect pronouns. And so somebody's story isn't visible unless there are community members who are doing that work to reset the narrative.
So, one of the things that I think, this opens us up to, the idea that we like to say Black is not a monolith. Like, this is something that we always like to say to, there are these conversations about like white people mixing people up at the office. It's like, how come you can't tell the difference? Or can't bother to learn names, that sort of thing. But I think that there's like a deeper thing in there, which is that we're not all having the same Black experience, right? And yes, before I continue with my question, I'll just say that we're at that point. Please put in questions. We're going to start taking audience questions soon, so get them in there. Please be respectful, but please ask your question about the book. I'm sure there's something that I haven't asked about that you want to know about. But so even like, you say, I'm sure you've had this experience of people thinking that you're a student or younger, and people might be looking at the two of us and saying, there's no way that they have linked experiences, right? And so what's interesting also is that you talk about the different ways that Black queer folks in particular are using media, like in these web series, to kind of try and analyze and address those links across different places of positionality with regard to like various axes of power, whether it's being cis, whether it's, being someone who is more frequently in relationships with cis men, whether it's being light skinned and having type 3 hair, like all of these different, and I think that there's been, a little bit of noise about, trying to cast misogynoir as only speaking to one set of Black experiences. So I'm, at the risk of asking you a question you don't want to be asked, I'm just like really thinking about like, in the same way that we recognize that these children are actually having very broad experiences that can't be universalized. What does that mean for talking about transforming misogynoir, talking about like Black queer feminism, and linking with each other in solidarity, even across what might seem like very big differences depending on what your social location is?
Chanda, you did that so beautifully.
Thank you.
We've been talking about just how colorism is something that definitely shapes our different experiences as Black women and people read as Black women, and that those experiences need to be discussed. And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're trying to have that discussion, we still gravitate and move towards a conversation about people who are these light-skinned people actually our kinfolk? Are they in some way pretenders? How do we deal with this question of what now has been termed white passing, which doesn't fit the white passing that I have known traditionally Black people to talk about? There's a way that our attention to language sometimes, and I'm saying this as somebody who coined a term, that sometimes our attention to language and terminology can distract us from the experiences and the lines of similarity that need to be addressed. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about that is specifically what's happening in the queer community. There was a great tweet that was going around talking about how there are queer trans elders who, because of their age, still use the term transsexual and find that to be the term that they're familiar with, the term that they like to use for themselves. But in a contemporary moment, transgender or trans is the way that we talk about that now. And so how do we understand that people are trying to make connections and we're doing what we can with the language that we have? I want us to also think about the very unique experiences that get lost and also which ones get centered when we're doing this work of policing each other, because it takes us away from the stories of, misogynoir that are experienced by dark-skinned Black women if we are specifically focusing on whether Meghan Markle is Black or not, which, again, I feel like that question has been answered, but it is one that has come up again and again, and definitely informs how people see misogynoir as a term operating.
So I actually think that this connects very nicely with a question that was put in by an anonymous attendee. And again, I just want to encourage people, if you have questions, ask them, and I will put them out there. And I'm actually going to add to this question. So the original question was, can you kindly apply misogynoir to the recent developments involving Naomi Osaka? And I think that the thing that I'm just going to add to this interesting question is that Naomi Osaka, like Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, is a Black and Asian woman. And I, at least, have perceived a difference in the dynamic around the willingness to articulate one as a Black woman and the other as a Black woman. And I find that kind of interesting. I'm just in connection, but I also do think that, Naomi is a very timely person to be discussing given what's happened in the last week.
Yeah, and I think to this question, this is where we also see misogynoir morphing and moving and not being a fixed point, and people's experiences also not being a fixed point. So you might recall that there was an Australian comic that ran in the newspaper when Naomi and Serena Williams played each other. And they portrayed Serena in a very misogynoiristic fashion, angry. They gave her an exaggerated mouth, big lips, really making Serena out to be this ugly caricature of a Black woman. And then Naomi is positioned beside her as very demure, very, looking in a way that is so in contrast to Serena Williams that it's hard even in this comic to understand them both as Black women. And to me, that is so interesting because if we go to this moment, now Naomi is feeling the real brunt of misogynoir in terms of how she's being depicted as being resistant, non-compliant, not doing what she's supposed to do. So now she is that angry Black woman that Serena was at this earlier moment. So I do think that misogynoir, unfortunately, is not static, it's dynamic. And the way that it moves is also contextualized by the situation. That Naomi can, in one moment, be presented as an acceptable and, the injured party in relationship to Serena. But now she's the aggressor and she's the one who's doing tennis a disservice by wanting to protect her mental health. I think that is definitely a part of this. And that ability to switch her out, to me, has a lot to do with her being both Black and Asian, as opposed to only being read as a Black woman.
Certainly, one of the things that jumps out to me about this is that in that comic strip, where they're kind of juxtaposed, one reading of it is that, Serena is the awful, dark-skinned aggressor. As you talk about in the book, that melanin is associated with masculinity. And so there's also this masculinization. And that Naomi is like the acceptable light-skinned alternative. And there's another reading of it, which is that it's not just that she's light-skinned, but there's also this stereotype of a Japanese woman as being more pliable, and Naomi plays for Japan. And so I think that that's also interesting, which is how sometimes anti-Asian discourses of anti-Asian racism get lost because people are looking through this very particular lens. And not realizing that also Naomi is definitely being read by people as, well, maybe she's as well-behaved like Asians are, right? And big air quotes, but particularly like East Asian women and light-skinned East Asian women.
And I think to your point, that's also why I think she's being read differently than Kamala Harris, right? Because Kamala doesn't have the same Asian ancestry operating in that way. Kamala has very much been embraced and understood in, just that there isn't the same sort of pliability associated with the Indian stereotype as there is with East Asia. So I do think that there's something to be said there as well, that for Kamala, it's the Blackness always already taking over in terms of how people read her. And that's how misogynoir shows up in her presentation. And of course, gets us distracted from the conversations we actually should be having about Kamala's policies and the things that are actually at issue that we actually should be concerned about when it comes to Kamala Harris.
Right. So there's definitely this kind of difficult line. Kamala can both be a victim of misogynoir, but that doesn't mean she's a Black feminist, right? Like her going to Guatemala today and saying the message from the United States is don't cross our border is not Black feminism. Right?
Absolutely not.
It's
Absolutely not.
But you know, since we're in the last couple of minutes and we're talking about Naomi Osaka, I think that there's another piece to this, which is, you know, when she first said, I'm not going to do the press conferences, I was thinking a lot about how Venus and Serena got demonized over the years and how they have both, I think, learned to speak in a particular way that sounds like, you know, if they were white, they would seem like the most demure, quiet, pliable, like nice white lady, right? And that's how they talk to the media. And it's like a skill and they kill it, right? And I really thought like Naomi is doing what she's doing now because she saw that example of you get to represent yourself, but also that as a light-skinned woman, that maybe she could push in ways that other people had not. But there's also this piece that she was saying, I'm mentally ill. I'm not sure that that's like the language that she would use, but she was saying, I'm depressed. I have a disability. And this disability needs to be accommodated by my workplace. Like just to recast it in the terms that I heard it as a disabled person, right? And you talk at the beginning of the book that your initial interest and in some ways maybe where your heart was in how media representations of Black women affected Black women's health and Black women's access to health and healthcare. And so I think that, you know, I'm interested in, do you feel like, so of course it appears in the book, but in some ways the book is really about misogynoir. Do you feel like now that you've gotten this book out that you're coming back to that, or there's a direction that you're going to go in with that? And can you give us a peek in the direction, maybe using Naomi as a point of conversation, but maybe not?
Yeah, I mean, the next book is Misogynoir in Medicine, and taking very seriously what happens to Black women in healthcare situations, both depending on whether they are healthcare providers or whether they're patients. And that unfortunately, on either side of the exam table, there's a real way that Black women are having to negotiate those spaces through misogynoir, both Black women being denied care. I think the story that resonates with me so deeply is the story of Dr. Susan Moore, who was a practicing physician, actually working with COVID patients and contracted COVID herself, went to the hospital, and then was not being treated well by her colleagues as other physicians, and moved to recording her experience through a Facebook Live and trying to make clear what was happening, but still ended up succumbing to the COVID symptoms that brought her into the hospital. And for me, that's such an important and unfortunate example of how misogynoir operates at the level of really impacting Black women's ability to survive in the world as it exists.
Yeah, I would actually, so there's a question here from Banu, and so I'll just read it for you because it's such a nice comment. This is such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for allowing us to be part of a scene of listening to two brilliant Black women talk with each other. Thank you. I want to hear you both talk more about alchemy and its relationship with the concept of misogynoir. I'd love to hear you both talk about how you understand the term historically and in contemporary politics of science and pseudoscience. And so maybe I'll just connect that with the comment that you just made. I really liked the term. I even wrote it down in the front of the book with the page number, defensive digital alchemy. And when I think about Dr. Moore, that she was basically crying out for help with these Facebook Lives, that she was engaging in defensive digital alchemy. She was literally defending her own life from what turned out to be her deathbed. And so I'm wondering, you know, maybe if you could say more about like why, what are the structural features that organize how she got treated by her colleagues in terms of like, you know, ideas about race science and.
Oh, yes. I mean, one of the classic examples that I think people have heard a lot about, and this is something that she acknowledges, is that she was treated as a drug seeker. So when she complained of pain, her pain wasn't believed, and it was assumed that she was trying to get drugs. And related to that, there's so much research that when Black children come in with appendix that burst or broken arms, they're not given the drugs that they need to manage pain, because there's an assumption that, well, they can take it. Again, that adultification that's happening to Black children. And I know we're just at time, but I really hope that folks are interested and want to hear more. And obviously, Chanda will continue to be in conversation about this, but yeah, I think there's more to be said about misogynoir in science and in medicine.
Absolutely. So I just want to thank you, Moya, so much for your thoughtful answers. And I just want to make a comment that I meant to say at the beginning, which was at each stage of the book, I know you to be maybe the most generous person on the planet. And I could feel that generosity just kind of coming out of the page, right down to you make a point, you take Cite Black women, the idea behind Cite Black women, to new levels, which is that you cite every person who helped you do an analysis, find a piece of information. And I think even just structurally, you're transforming misogynoir by setting a new standard of how we talk about how our work gets done. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that and say, for that reason alone, people should pick up this book as an example. And then also remember, cite Black women. So make sure to cite the book.
Thank you so much, Chanda.
Thank you both so much. I wonder, before we go, I know we're a little bit over, but I don't have anywhere to be. If you could both tell us what you're working on next.
Yeah, so in addition to the Misogynoir in Medicine book, the Digital Humanities Apothecary will be coming soon through Northwestern, and it's an opportunity to think more about how we use digital space to create what we need.
I was trying to figure out which version of this answer I should give. Most immediately, dark matter and neutron stars. That's like a project I'm super excited about. I'm also working on another project where we're going to constrain the properties of dark matter using a phenomenon called gravitational lensing, which is basically so much dark matter that space-time acts like a funhouse mirror. I also talk I'll just give a shout out for the Disordered Cosmos. I talk briefly in the Disordered Cosmos about how weak gravitational lensing is a good analogy for systemic racism. But I'm very excited about this gravitational lensing project because it will be my first time publishing with other Black scientists. And that's a treasure that I'm very excited about.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. This was an amazing event. Everyone, please pick up Misogynoir Transformed and Disordered Cosmos at Brookline Booksmith. You can find future events at brooklinebooksmith.com/events. Chanda, Moya, thank you both so much. And I hope you have great evenings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.